All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to TAO's next session of our Member Resiliency series, Surviving Today, Thriving Tomorrow, with Mark Benarski. I'm Skip Newberry, CEO and President of TAO. A couple of rules of engagement before we get started. All participants have been muted, so please remain on mute unless a member of the TAO team calls on you to talk. You may ask or respond to questions in the chat box, publicly or privately, by directing your message to Justin Martinez or to Kara Snow. We'll monitor the chat box and respond throughout the conversation. We'll ask you all to engage via the participant icon on your screen, and please engage with us via social media. We definitely encourage you to take some screenshots of myself and Mark chatting today, and if you share those via social, you'll definitely get a reshare from us. Due to the limited time, we'll capture all questions in the chat and shift any unanswered questions to our online member engagement platform, which is called Mobilize. Mobilize is where we'll keep the conversation going following today's event. And if you have any questions about joining Mobilize, you can reach out to Justin, whose email is on the screen. If you have any questions about joining TAO, you can reach out to membership@techoregon.org. TAO staff support is provided by Kara Snow and Justin, who are happy to take feedback, questions, comments, or discuss sponsorship opportunities. Also, in partnership with Free Geek, the business community has been uniting to host Tech Now, which is a series of contactless drive-through technology collection sites across the Portland area over a 2-week period beginning May 27th. There will be a collection site hosted in the TAO parking lot on Sunday, May 31st, and employers are encouraged to share the campaign with their employees as well as with the broader public. Our ambitious goal is to collect 10,000 devices through both technology and financial contributions, as current estimates show that there is a need for 75,000 devices across the state of Oregon in order to help facilitate distance learning among our schools. A huge thank you to Packstar and Peggy Miller for her support for this series. We couldn't do it without her. And I'd like you to also please join us June 2nd on Tuesday for our next session with TAO board member Jen Stoll, Executive Vice President of Government Relations and Public Affairs with OCHN, and Oregon State Rep Pam Marsh to discuss digital health access to broadband for telehealth. It's now my pleasure to introduce Mark, who's the VP of Product with iGrafx. Mark has worked at iGrafx for the past 13 years, typically on lots of business trips across the globe, and is now confined to a cage called the home office. He's guarded by 2 girls, ages 4 and 8, and his wife. Mark, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So we'll just jump right into questions. So it appears a lot of companies feel that they aren't particularly well prepared for a situation like we now find ourselves in with the COVID-19 crisis. I'm wondering, in your experience, have you found that certain industries deal better with crises than others?
First, I have to say that iGrafx typically is dealing with very large enterprises. That's where I'm in most contact with, but we also have customers who are a lot smaller, just like 50 or 100 people, but typically the ones I get most exposure with are the extremely large ones. And I had a lot of discussions over the recent months with them, and it feels like those customers who are in heavily regulated industries actually deal quite a bit better than with the unregulated industries. So, and I think it's very easy explained. Financial crisis that led to certain regulations, and a couple of those regulations have in mind the test and the proof of resiliency. So, yeah, there's an opportunistic aspect of such a crisis. It's always the case, but for a lot of large organizations and smaller ones, first and foremost, it's surviving. So I can only think about an opportunity if I actually have the substance to deal with the crisis at hand. If large workforces fail, if processes default, if financial struggles come up, I don't have the bandwidth to think about how can I make an opportunity out of this problem because I'm struggling with daily life. And those enterprises who are exposed to extensive business continuity testing, so they actually have to test their business continuity and resiliency procedures, they deal a lot better with it. It doesn't come as a surprise, but typically what I see, when, especially when you talk on executive level, the large corporations, they have over the last years developed so many strategies to learn from small companies how to innovate again, how to be agile again, how to do this and that. And it's publicly known. And yet they have, because of their size, the capacity to actually deal and plan with those scenarios, what happens if, and then they have risk awareness programs, they deal with testing those things, and they do this over and over and over again. And here, I think the realization for a lot smaller companies is that I can actually learn something from the large companies. A lot of small companies take pride that, oh, we don't have this enterprise stuff, and we don't need this. Well, some of it is actually not as stupid as you think. So I wouldn't say necessarily industries per se, but certainly banking and pharmaceutical, who is heavily regulated, they have a slight advantage here. And they planned all those things, so they shifted a lot quicker, and then we're able to recover quicker. Of course, it's Friday, it's our trash day. Let me close the window. The non-Java garbage collector. Sorry, tech joke.
That's all right. We had I was on a call a couple weeks ago with a guy who was on the East Coast, and he had a FedEx delivery in the middle of his conversation with me. You never know in this virtual world. So that's great. So more on size of company than industry in terms of preparedness.
No, industry, it is the pharmaceutical, medical, actually more the pharmaceutical side, and banking for sure, because of not so recent events, the regulators found their way to test for it. There are resiliency requirements to prove that you are able to deal with economic effects. The problem with DR, and there's, in my opinion, very often a misconception between disaster recovery and resiliency, and there's standards around that, like take ISO 22301. That's the standard for disaster recovery. It's very IT centric, and everybody at first, most companies at least, think, oh, disaster recovery, that's IT stuff. We need to make sure the computers were shifting resources, VPN access, remote desktop, all this stuff. Or what is if there's an intrusion? So they think about security. But what they don't think about is how your process change by changing just where labor is situated. How does your process change? Even if the IT doesn't change, so it is a resiliency project. Is not IT centric, because that's disaster recovery. So the disaster recovery is geared around an impact, a short time incident, an intrusion, a zero-day vulnerability, or whatever. So how do I get back? That's the primary focus of the DR. The focus of a DR is not shifting work from one area of the company to another area of the company. So there's a different perspective to it, and for me the resiliency aspect starts with DR. If that is not there, there's also no way to get into resiliency. But what I want to stress is that for me the focus on resiliency is that you need to come back even stronger after a short impact. And it doesn't matter if the short impact means like a one-day attack, or if it's I don't know how many months lockdown. We need to get back out of that faster, as fast as possible once the incident is over, with changed business models, and the processes in the meantime need to continue to run. It's the core competency typically in most companies is not IT. we're not proud that we have an IT department. We're proud of what we produce. Our core competency is that we do something better than someone else. And unless you're an IT service provider, it's typically not the IT department.
That's an interesting observation. So as you're thinking about the distinction between, say, disaster recovery, you made a good point that, good resiliency planning starts with disaster recovery, but disaster recovery is different from a resiliency plan because the resiliency plan could be ongoing, it's continuous, right?
Yeah.
You're responding to a variety of different shocks over time, and they could be different over time. But so I'm wondering, is it possible to prepare for events like this one, which is not like a single event, not a single moment in time where you're quickly recovering, it's over, great, now we're on to the next thing. Instead, it's like, okay, we're kind of in crisis still. We will be for some period of time, and there could be additional shocks. So, how do companies plan for that?
Yeah, well, I have quite some personal experience with that, actually. And again, because it's not IT-centric, the resiliency management for me is actually closer to risk management. Yeah. So if you think about it that way, how you prepare for it, it's like you prepare for any other risk. And now we have a health situation. It could have been something else, like a natural disaster, or political problems. We do have a lot of multinational customers who say we're dealing in countries where the political situation is not as stable as in the US. That implies that it is a stable political situation. I would not have liked to say that right now, but especially not an election year. But what's the state which is having currently a sort of a rioting problem? Well,
Minneapolis and Minnesota.
It's not that far away. So there are always situations in businesses which have a little bit of larger reach that they have to deal with instabilities. And you can plan for those things by doing a proper risk management and then actually test your control plans. So what we typically do is we advise customers, and again, we're just a software manufacturer. We are not producing the frameworks on how to deal with that. We're just producing software that allows consultants and companies to deal with those things. We're not the content, we're just only the software. And it's typically what the consultants advise is there that you have controlled and uncontrolled risks or resiliency strategies, and you have to maintain both. So that if something happens which you're not planned, and you cannot plan for COVID, that is simply not possible. It's like in statistics, when the predictability of an exact result is zero. You can't predict an exact result, but you can actually get pretty close to reality. So you try to think about various scenarios, and then when actually an impact hits, you look into what class does it fall, you open the drawer, you get your plans out, and then you need to adjust. So if you plan that way, it's a lot easier to find the smarter tuning knobs versus just, oh shit, I never thought about that. What to do now? Well, how are people working from the home office? It will be all fine. And not ashamed or afraid to say that, yeah, I've seen this over the last months. They say, oh, I'll go to the home office, fine. And then they actually don't know what impact that has. Yeah, we will see the outcome at the end. We have quite some interesting scenarios we see.
Yeah, on the work from home front, I remember in early March I was in a meeting with the CEO of a company that had hundreds of people, call center that they were shifting to completely remote for the first time in the company's history, and they had to write essentially a work from home policy in like 3 days. And so it was kind of like let's scramble and figure out how we can put this together and hope it works. And I'm wondering, in terms of the work from home environment, especially for white collar workers, are there certain hidden risks there, or anything that you'd recommend in terms of what you've seen over time to companies that now find themselves totally in that environment?
Well, let me pair that with your previous question. Can you prepare for those things? And then how about white-collar workers? Because yeah, the assumption is, well, you're working on a plane anyway. You have your computer, just do your stuff. Well, for certain jobs like mine, absolutely no problem. I can work anywhere. I work there where the time zone. That's why I moved to the U.S. to be closer to the engineering department and being in the head offices for time zone reasons, not that I couldn't have done my work in Germany where I'm from.
Mm-hmm.
Other workers don't have that luxury because, and you just said, was it an insurance? They wrote their home office
Yeah, the
policy?
work from home policy, essentially.
Yeah. So they were shocked. They haven't properly prepared and they have never tested it. And if that would have been a larger financial organization, that would have been impossible because I know this as a requirement. They're mandated from the feds, and they need to test it. Why do they need to test that? And is it possible for all white-collar workers? No insurance? No, it's actually not. Because sometimes you're simply not allowed to process the data either outside of the company walls or shift it between states or countries. Let's take someone who lives in Canada and works in Washington. Now works from home, you need to send eventually a member or insurance information to Canada, and you may, through HIPAA or whatever, that's maybe not legal. You may not have spent a second thought about it, and well, what's the difference if I walk to the office in Washington, which is just across the border? Where's the problem if I just do the same thing from home? Well, the problem is that there are regulations that prevent you to do that.
Yep.
So, and this can cause you some serious amount of fines. And that's a set of regulations we actually see coming. Like with previous financial crises, we've seen regulations ramp up afterwards, starting with SOX and then SOX being migrated over to other forms of Fed regulations. See here the same thing, and yeah, of course, companies prepared for that. They tested it, and then while testing, they noticed those things. So you can do it, but again, it requires a certain amount of thinking about it, what could actually happen. But they're political, natural disasters, health disasters. They're basic playbooks you can work around.
So I'm wondering, do you see like a kind of a business continuity and resiliency gap between industries in the U.S. and also, given your global experience, I'd imagine also between different jurisdictions, different countries and regions? Because I mean, if you're thinking about like the banking industry in the U.S. versus other industries, obviously there's a distinction there because of the regulation required in one, but not necessarily the others. But then you also look at the different regs from, say, Europe in finance versus the U.S., there's distinctions, right? So I'm wondering, like, how do you explain the differences there, and you know, are there things lessons to be learned for companies here in the U.S. from stuff you've seen elsewhere?
Well, particular for us, it's the difference between Europe and the U.S. I think we talked about the industries earlier, and there you have definitely pharmaceutical and banking being the heavily regulated ones. But even if those heavily regulated ones, if you dare compare the US with Europe, which for me now includes the UK, Europe and Germany, they have very strict banking laws. And in what the cultural differences is that Europe in general is more law-driven. So regulation authority driven versus in the US, it needs to happen first before you get some sort of lukewarm, not law, but a regulation or policy around, and someone tries to half-heartedly. It's a lot less regulation driven in the US.
Yeah.
And however, in the US, those regulations, because they're not really laws, they come with hefty fines. So the mindset is different. If you don't put a hefty fine around, no one does it in the US. In Germany, very often it is enough to put it in law because it's the law, you do it. and the fines are lower, but you have more laws. So there's a difference in perception. That's a major thing. So we see our European customers being way more structured in their approach. Like there are a lot more frameworks in place. There are a lot of connecting tissue between those frameworks, and this helps in such scenarios. Then there's also the political differences to the U.S., which certainly help there. That's, in my opinion, that's why European actually deals a little bit better there with the current crisis, is because of the preparedness. On the other hand, in the US, you have way more theoretical freedom to do something good out of it. I don't want to weigh what is better or worse. It's different.
Yep. So I'm wondering, like, between business continuity planning and resiliency, like, what are some of the sort of lessons learned or overlap that you can draw from this? So what, if you were recommending to a company that's looking at business continuity planning and putting in some of these frameworks, how does that make them more resilient over time?
Well, of course, when you just start, you should not try to do it yourself. You will miserably fail. If you're not just a 20-person shop, talk with someone who actually has done it before, and make sure that they actually use industry frameworks. And my personal recommendation, because that is really just me, because that's how I operate, I typically look in my industry, but then also in other industries, how they do it, and try to learn from someone else. Because it's so easy to be blind, especially for, well, Tao has technology in its name, especially for techies. It is so easy to just go down the IT and tech route. It's so convenient. It's just, well, IT, I understand that. I can do something with it, and I can understand hacking. I can understand this and home office, no problem. So I think I have, and if I'm not looking further, I'm feeling a false sense of security, and I get lulled into this. I'm comfortable and I know what I'm doing, and the problem is not only yourself has this problem, but also the people who develop the frameworks for your industry. And the more niche the industry gets, the more susceptible to this problem you become, because you stew in your own soup. You need to look somewhere else. What do they do? So when I talk to bankers, I typically say, like, you think you're regulated? Try find someone in your circle of friends or family who's actually working in pharmaceuticals, because they will tell you what real regulation means. And with the pharmaceuticals, I tell them usually, well, look at the bank people, because, well, they're square. It's like they have less variety. How can you make it actually that you can do your stuff, less diverse? How you structure things. Bankers are awesome in structuring stuff, and pharmaceutical people are very often very, open in their minds. The bankers are not. That's stereotypes, but you can learn from those things. They usually have a reason, and there's usually a good reason behind. So try to talk to someone who has done it before, and then after that also look into other industries to see what they do and learn from them. That's a certain amount of thinking involved, but I think it's well worth the time, because you're less likely to miss the most obvious things.
Yep. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That's great advice. And I'm wondering too, like, we've asked the same kind of completely irreverent question of all of our guests. You know, in this virtual environment we now find ourselves, what's the most embarrassing or awkward mishap that you've experienced?
I told that to Kara already to get approved.
She did a good job of keeping that secret. I don't know it yet.
Oh, good. Because I was asking, does it need to be COVID related or not? And the answer was no. It was about home office and working Zoom conferences. And it's actually 3 years ago or so. I'm having every 3 weeks a call with CEO of a supplier to align our product developments. And because of the time difference, for me it was my day. For him it was already in the evening. He was sitting in his home office. I didn't realize that his home office was his bedroom. Yeah, and his girlfriend was walking in from the bathroom and trying to get some clothes out of, and she was wearing none. Uh, so, and coming back to the cultural differences in the US, it would have been probably a big deal, but here two Europeans talking, and so she walked in, grabbed the t-shirt, went away, and he just turned around and said, okay, and we moved on.
I think you're right. That would have been a big deal in the U.S. That's funny. Well, thank you, Mark, for taking some time out of your schedule to spend with us this morning. I really enjoyed the conversation, and I'm sure our attendees did too. Also want to say thank you to Peggy Miller and Packstar again for helping us underwrite this series. We couldn't do it without her. And again, thank you to everyone who took some time out of your Friday morning to spend with us this morning. And to the extent that we have some extra questions or other things that we get shared with us, we'll follow up with Mark, and then we'll move this to the Mobilize channel. This will also be available in our YouTube channel afterwards as well. So thank you, Mark. Thank you, all of the attendees, and hope you all have a great weekend. Thanks.